Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a massive historical event today. We're going to look at exactly what happens when a huge group of new people suddenly moves into a land where other folks are already living. Spoiler alert, it literally changed the map forever.
I want you to imagine something for a second. Picture thousands of people suddenly moving into your neighborhood, just all at once. What do you think would happen to the people who already live there? Where's everyone going to live? And how do you get along if you all have completely different rules and traditions? Well, this isn't just some made-up scenario. This is exactly what happened right at the end of the American Revolution.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the Great Migration. Second, the impact on First Nations. Third, dividing Quebec. Fourth, changing the Maritimes. And finally, a new map.
All right, part one, the Great Migration. Let's see how this all started.
Right after the American Revolution, a massive group of people, known as Loyalists, packed up and moved to British North America. And to really understand the sheer size of this, just think about the numbers. You had 12,000 people already living in Nova Scotia, but then 35,000 new Loyalists arrived. That is a massive wave of people. There were suddenly way more newcomers than the people who already called it home.
Moving on to part two, let's look at the direct impact this had on the First Nations.
This scene paints a really clear picture of a peaceful Mi'kmaq camp back in 1791. You can see the families, the canoes, their homes right by the water. It's a beautiful spot, right? Well, the new Loyalists thought so too. They wanted this prime, fertile land near the water to build their own farms. And unfortunately, they just took it.
To get all this land for the waiting Loyalists as fast as possible, the British government used hurried, completely unfair treaties. Now, a treaty is supposed to be a fair agreement, but these were definitely not fair. Sometimes the British just made quick verbal promises to the First Nations instead of actually writing things down. And sadly, they broke those promises time and time again, completely ignoring the rights of their First Nations allies just to grab that land quickly. The Grand Council of the Mi'kmaq Nation put it this way: "This activity disrupted our economies and began to severely restrict our people's access to the land." What that really means is that losing their land made it incredibly hard for the Mi'kmaq to hunt, to fish, and just to survive. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It led to severe starvation and a truly heartbreaking loss of life by the 1790s.
Okay, on to part three, dividing Quebec.
So, about 8,000 Loyalists ended up moving to Quebec. And let me tell you, they were not happy. Quebec was already home to the French-speaking Canadiens. The Canadiens were Catholic, and they had their own traditional French rules for owning land. But the British Loyalists, they wanted their own British rules, and they wanted to own their land outright, the way they were used to.
Because these two groups wanted entirely different things, the political tension was rising fast. It was a real powder keg. Which forces us to ask the big question: how in the world do you keep the peace between two completely different cultures? You've got one shared territory, but two groups of people who absolutely cannot agree on the laws, the religion, or even how to own land.
Well, the government's solution was just to split Quebec right down the middle. On one side of that line, Upper Canada was created specifically for the British Loyalists, using English and British laws, and on the other side, Lower Canada was created for the French Canadians, so they could keep their French language, their Catholic religion, and their traditional land system. They literally drew a line on the map to keep the two cultures completely separate.
That brings us to part four, changing the Maritimes.
Now, when the Loyalists arrived over in Nova Scotia, they obviously met the settlers who were already living there. But there was a catch. During the American Revolution, those existing settlers had remained neutral. They didn't pick a side to fight on. And because of that, the new Loyalist refugees just flat out didn't trust them. So the Loyalists aggressively demanded their very own separate territories, completely away from the locals.
To solve this huge lack of trust, the government stepped in and actually chopped the original Nova Scotia region into three brand new, totally separate colonies. They created Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton Island.
But get this, here's a really surprising fact. The government created Cape Breton Island specifically for the Loyalists, right? Well, only about 100 of them actually ended up moving there. 100! Because so few people went, the colony struggled and stayed super small for a really long time. In fact, it wasn't until much later, in the 1800s when Scottish immigrants arrived, that Cape Breton finally began to grow.
And finally, part five, a new map. Let's pull this all together. We've seen the First Nations pushed off their traditional lands. We've seen Quebec divided right in two. And we've seen the maritime colonies totally split up, all because people just didn't trust each other. So,
This leaves us with a really important question to think about. Did this sudden arrival of the Loyalists actually improve life for the people whose home it already was? It's a tough question, for sure, but thinking about it helps us understand exactly how the map we know today was actually drawn. Thanks so much for joining me on today's Explainer, and I'll catch you next time.